I always felt drawn to the quiet allure of the countryside. As a seasoned hunter, the solitude and the thrill of the hunt were what I lived for. So, when I found an old farmhouse for sale about 7 miles from my father's place, I jumped at the chance to escape city life and be closer to him. The farmhouse, though in need of some repair, had a charming rustic appeal. It sat on the edge of dense, dark woods that I hadn't yet explored. On my first day, I decided to tame the overgrown lawn. As I pushed the mower along, a heavy stick came flying out of nowhere, hitting me square on the shoulder. Startled, I looked around but saw nothing. The woods, shrouded in shadows, offered no clues. Brushing off the incident, I decided to investigate further. Grabbing my flashlight and a sturdy walking stick, I ventured into the forest. The air grew cooler and the light dimmer as I penetrated deeper. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches interlocking to form a nearly impenetrable canopy. I noticed strange markings on the trees, scratches and symbols that seemed almost deliberate. A sense of being watched crept over me, urging me to return to the safety of my home. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I set up surveillance cameras around my property, focusing especially on the tree line where the stick had come from. That night, I pored over the footage. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I saw it. A large, shadowy figure moving with surprising agility through the trees. The figure was massive, much larger than any animal I had ever seen. The next morning, with the strange footage fresh in my mind, I decided to visit the local sheriff. He was an old friend of my father's and listened with a skeptical ear. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said. "But you're not the first to report strange sightings in those woods." His casual dismissal did little to ease my mind. Feeling unsettled, I drove to my father's house. Over a cup of strong coffee, I recounted the events of the past few days. My father listened intently, then leaned back in his chair with a grave expression. "There's been talk for years about a creature in those woods," he said. "Old-timers call it Bigfoot. Most folks think it's just a legend, but we've seen things they can't explain. Be careful, son." Determined to protect my new home, I used my hunting skills to fortify the perimeter of my property. I set up motion-activated lights and installed security cameras, hoping to deter any unwanted visitors. The following morning, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed a blur of movement near the edge of the woods. When I ventured out to investigate, all I found were large, indistinct footprints embedded in the soil, far too big to be human. The realization that something was lurking just beyond my property line sent a shiver down my spine. Each of these actions brought me closer to an unsettling truth. As I stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the shadowy depths, I knew one thing for certain: something was out there watching me. It was only a matter of time before our paths crossed again, as the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn. I knew it was time to put aside my thoughts of the mysterious creature lurking in the woods. With a sigh, I turned off the security monitors and made my way outside. The smell of freshly cut grass filled the air as I fired up the lawnmower once again. With each pass, the rhythmic hum of the engine drowned out the nagging doubts that had been plaguing me all day. As I worked, my mind drifted to the practical matters at hand. I needed to find a job to sustain myself in this new chapter of my life. The thought of delving back into the world of employment after years of freedom in the wilderness was daunting but necessary. With each swath of grass I mowed, I felt a sense of accomplishment wash over me. There was something therapeutic about the simple act of manual labor, a welcome distraction from the complexities of life. As the last of the sunlight faded from the sky, I finally finished mowing the lawn. Surveying my handiwork, I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. Tomorrow was a new day, full of possibilities and challenges, but for now, I would savor this moment of peace and quiet, knowing that whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it head-on. The lawn job hit a snag when the mower collided with several sizable rocks, undoubtedly causing damage to the blade. The following morning, upon closer inspection, it became evident that the blade was in dire need of sharpening and balancing. Determined to rectify the situation, I removed the blade and made my way to the local hardware store. However, my plans were thwarted when I discovered that the hardware store didn't offer lawnmower blade sharpening services because the owner lacked the necessary expertise. Undeterred, I decided to purchase a grinder and take matters into my own hands. As I stood in line to pay for the grinder, I struck up a conversation with the clerk about the challenges I faced with the rocks in my lawn. Expressing my frustration, I explained that buying a new blade seemed futile, as I was certain to encounter more rocks on my next mowing venture. It struck me as peculiar how my lawn seemed to be littered with so many rocks, posing a constant obstacle to my landscaping efforts. While browsing the aisles of the hardware store, my attention was drawn to a conspicuous "Help Wanted" sign positioned near the checkout counter. Seizing the opportunity, I approached the clerk and expressed my interest in a part-time position. I explained that I was currently in the midst of restoring my new home and could benefit from some additional income to offset the restoration expenses. To my surprise, the clerk led me to the back room and gestured towards a vise and my newly acquired grinder. He instructed me to use the equipment to sharpen and balance my lawnmower blade. Eager to resolve the issue, I followed his guidance and set to work. As I meticulously honed the blade, ensuring its sharpness and balance, time seemed to slip away. Just as I was completing the task, the owner returned and inspected my handiwork. With a keen eye, he scrutinized the angle and sharpness of the blade before nodding in approval. "Perfect," he declared, his tone filled with satisfaction. With a smile, he informed me that I was hired and instructed me to report for work the following day at 8 a.m. Grateful for the unexpected opportunity, I left the hardware store with a renewed sense of purpose and anticipation for the days ahead. During my journey home, I made a quick stop at the butcher shop to pick up a couple of juicy steaks. Excited to show off my new home to my dad, I extended an invitation, and he agreed to visit in about half an hour. Upon returning home, I wasted no time in heading to the kitchen to prepare the steaks for grilling. With deft hands, I seasoned the meat and set it aside, ready to be cooked to perfection. Peering through the back door, my eyes landed on the inviting fire pit, nestled just 40 yards away and only about 30 feet from the edge of the woods. It seemed like the perfect spot for outdoor gatherings, with its warm glow promising cozy evenings ahead. Setting up the barbecue grill a short distance from the fire pit, I began by stoking it with charcoal, ensuring it would be ready for grilling. Then, eager to add to the ambiance, I collected some wood for the fire pit, envisioning crackling flames and dancing shadows under the evening sky. Just as I finished preparing, the familiar rumble of my father's new red pickup truck drew my attention. He had arrived right on time, ready to share in the excitement of exploring my new home. I guided my dad inside and gave him a tour of the place. His approval was evident, though I suspected any location within 10 miles of his own home would have met his standards. Still, his praise was reassuring, and I couldn't help but share in his enthusiasm for my new home. As we settled in, I mentioned the earlier stick incident, attributing it to mischievous kids, or perhaps just a strange coincidence. Despite that hiccup, everything seemed to be going smoothly now, and I was grateful for the peace of mind. I suggested we relax with a couple of beers while I threw on the steaks, with the savory aroma filling the air and cold beers in hand. We enjoyed a leisurely evening, savoring the perfectly cooked steaks, basking in the warmth of the fire pit, and relishing the comfort of each other's company. After a long evening of conversation, Dad eventually headed home, and I returned to the house to crash. It must have been around 11 or 11:30. At around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a huge bang and the house shaking violently. My first thought was an earthquake, but then I remembered I was back in Michigan where earthquakes of this magnitude were virtually unheard of. I rushed downstairs to find the front door wide open, swaying in the night breeze. My security system was blaring, and on the monitor, I caught a glimpse of a massive figure retreating into the woods. Grabbing my .30-06, I placed it on the chair next to the couch and tried to calm down. Just as I started to doze off, A loud crash jolted me awake, sounding like it came from the well house. I got up to look out the window, and suddenly, a rock about the size of a baseball came flying toward the house, hitting it with a loud cracking sound. I grabbed my phone and dialed my dad, my hands trembling as I recounted what was happening. "Dad, something's attacking the house. It's throwing rocks, huge rocks. I saw a massive figure running into the woods earlier. You need to get here and call the police." As I hung up, another rock slammed against the side of the house. I sprinted back upstairs, grabbed my 12-gauge pump shotgun along with my 30-06, and rummaged for my spotlight and some shells. Opening my bedroom window, I aimed the spotlight into the darkness, trying to pinpoint where the rocks were coming from. I could barely make out the shadows in the distance, but I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. A barrage of rocks continued, occasionally hitting the house, the garage, and even the barn. Several times when I saw movement, I fired shots into the air. The shotgun seemed to keep the rock throwers at bay, but they still lobbed rocks from a distance. Despite using my spotlight, I could no longer see any shadows moving in the darkness. About the time I could no longer see the rock throwers with my spotlight headlights appeared in the distance. I saw my dad's truck pulling up, following a police cruiser. The rocks stopped flying as the area was suddenly illuminated by flashing lights. My dad and the officers jumped out, guns drawn. I yelled out the window that I would be right out. Then I went outside and explained to the police officer the entire story. As the rain of boulders pelts down upon the property, I scrambled for cover, seeking refuge behind the nearest sturdy structures. My dad and I exchange worried glances, realizing the severity of the situation. With each crashing impact, it becomes increasingly clear that this is no ordinary attack. Since this event, I've actually seen the creatures sneaking around my property, hunting for deer. I've witnessed the Bigfoot creatures catch and kill a deer walking down my fence line. I've lit up my yard with security lamps on 40-foot-tall posts and picked up and mowed away the rocks and boulders in my lawn. Sometimes I find the occasional rock in my lawn, and sometimes I have to readjust my security lamps, but nowadays, for the most part, they pretty much don't bother me.